Chapter 1. Zenobia.
Well, I want to tell you, I never smelled anything so awful in my life. The scent of death was just clinging to the thing.
Marilyn Sparks paused, a forkful of broccoli halfway to her mouth, and stared at her Aunt Zenobia in a combination of awe and astonishment. It was hard to believe any one person could have had so many adventures, and even harder to believe she would dare to tell them at this table. Marilyn glanced at her father. He was scowling at Zenobia, the same disapproving scowl he used on his English students when they got out of line. Zenobia ignored him, a fiercely independent woman who had somehow cropped up in a family full of people-pleasers. She was long used to scandalizing her relatives. It was almost a tradition, one that had begun way back when she refused to get married and settle down, at a time when living as a single woman was far from fashionable.
That had seemed funny to Marilyn when she had first heard it. Zenobia seemed too young to have had such a problem.
But then Marilyn had a hard time remembering that Zenobia Calkins was really her great-aunt and had already seen her 70th birthday. Marilyn didn't think about age when she thought about Zenobia. She just adored her.
Anyway,
continued Zenobia,
Baron de Corvus drew out his machete and started to hack at the dead flesh. Of course, in that climate, the thing had become a breeding ground for maggots. And
Marilyn's mother cut Zenobia off with a sound that was just short of a shriek.
Really, Aunt Zenobia, couldn't you tell this some other time?
Marilyn sighed. She should have known she could count on her mother to stop Zenobia right at the most interesting moment. A story about recovering a giant diamond from the intestines of a 5-day dead rogue elephant, no matter how fascinating, simply did not fall within Helen Sparks' definition of table talk. Not even if it came from her father's sister. Zenobia looked at Mrs. Sparks with something that seemed like pity.
Of course, my dear, she said sweetly. I don't know what came over me.
Marilyn put the limp broccoli in her mouth and chewed it morosely. Her family was so stodgy. "You will finish the story later, won't you, Miss Calkins?" asked Kyle Patterson, gangly but good-looking, a year older than Marilyn and unfortunately her brother's best friend. Kyle
had hardly taken a bite since they had sat down to supper. He was much too excited about being at the same table with a great author to eat.
It was the first time Marilyn had ever seen Kyle ignore food, and she had known him since he was 3.
I don't know,
said Zenobia with a touch of petulance.
One has to be in the mood for these things to do them properly.
Kyle looked stricken.
Of course she'll tell us,
Jeff said jovially.
Aunt Zenobia never let a good story go untold, did you, Nobi?
Marilyn glared at her brother. He was clearly unaware of how deeply their mother had offended Aunt Zenobia.
Not if the audience is appreciative,
agreed Zenobia, deftly skewering a piece of chicken with her fork.
This bird is a trifle bland, by the way, she said sweetly, turning to Marilyn's mother. You might try using a bit of lemon, Helen. They do it that way in Tangiers. It works quite well.
Silence descended on the table.
It is bland,
thought Marilyn. She hacked a piece from her own serving of PTA cookbook chicken a little more savagely than was necessary, wishing it were some fierce raptor she had somehow managed to kill with her bare hands.
His whole family is bland. Mr. and Mrs. Normal Q boring and their children, that's us. I don't know why Kyle bothers with us.
She looked across the table to where Kyle was sitting, generally oblivious to her presence, as he had been for most of the last 14 years, and smiled. He had given up on waiting for Zenobia to resume her story, and finally started to eat.
That's more like it,
she thought fondly. You could use it.
It wasn't that Kyle was skinny, but he had topped 6 feet this year, and his body was still filling out to match the growing he had been doing. He had a thatch of tousled blonde hair, which Marilyn was itching to brush away from his forehead, and shocking blue eyes that seemed to bore right through her, whenever he bothered to look her way at all. He was at once more silly and more serious than any person she had ever known, and she had no idea why he bothered with her brother Jeff, but she was awfully glad he did. When they gathered together on the porch after supper, Marilyn thought for a moment that Kyle had finally noticed her. She was leaning against the railing, and he took a place right next to her. She was thrilled, until she realized his reason. It placed him directly across from Zenobia, who was leaning against the opposite railing next to Jeff. Her parents, of course, were inside, talking about how awful Zenobia was, probably. Marilyn looked at her aunt and wondered for an instant if Kyle actually found her attractive. She was, after all, a striking woman. Her hair was pure white, really dazzling, so unlike the yellowy gray she saw on other old people. It curled around her face like a billowing cloud, accentuating the depth of her tan. Marilyn knew the time her aunt had spent in the tropical sun added to her wrinkles, but like everything else about her, the wrinkles were attractive. Every one of them seemed to speak of experience, wisdom, even adventure. They were part of Zenobia. Zenobia was beautiful, so by definition, the wrinkles were too. She was dressed in white cotton, a crisp skirt, and a stylish blouse. A sturdy gold chain circled her neck, holding an amulet that, uncharacteristically and even unstylishly, she kept tucked inside her blouse. Marilyn wondered what it looked like. She had a vague recollection that sometime earlier in the evening, Zenobia had mentioned that everything she was wearing had come from Egypt. "So, what happened with the diamond, Miss Calkins?" asked Kyle eagerly. Zenobia waved her hand.
The Baron cut open the elephant, and there it was. We sold it on the coast for a handsome profit."
Kyle looked like someone had pulled his plug. "Is that all?"
"Well, that leaves out the details, but that's how it all came out."
"But it's the details that make it interesting."
"I know that, young man. I've managed to learn a few things in 30 years of writing bestsellers, but it's a little difficult to leap into the middle of a story with both feet. You have to build your momentum. Mine is still in the dining room under the cake plate."
"I'm sorry about Mom," said Marilyn. "She's pretty set in her ways." Zenobia dismissed the topic with another wave of her hand.
"I've been dealing with the fogies in this family since I was 6 years old, and shocked them by announcing I was going to run away with the minister of the Presbyterian Church."
She paused to reflect for a moment, then added,
"Actually, I think I said I was going to seduce him. Though where I learned that word, I can't remember."
She took out a cigar and bit off the end of it.
"It was the beginning of the end, as far as the family was concerned."
She struck a wooden match on the porch railing and lit her cigar, then smoked in silence for a moment. The 3 teenagers waited for her to speak again.
"Maybe I should have stayed in Egypt,"
she said with a sigh, flicking her ash over the railing.
"I got along quite well there. Felt right at home. I always wondered if maybe I had lived there in a previous life."
"Is Cairo as awful as it looks in the movies?" asked Kyle eagerly. He was an old film buff and tended to view the world in terms of what he saw on late-night television.
"Awful? It's wonderful. Did I ever tell you about the time I got caught in a riot there with that fool, Eldred Cooley?
Without waiting for an answer, she launched into a bizarre story involving Egyptian politics, Chinese jewelry, 3 dancing girls, and a monkey. Kyle settled back contentedly. Marilyn let herself lean ever so slightly in his direction. It was very pleasant. The evening had an early summer sweetness to it, cool and filled with the scent of fading lilacs and blooming roses. The moon was nearly full, the sky cloudless and smeared with stars. In the background, the spring peepers were in full chorus, and Zenobia was at the peak of her form with the blood-curdling story she was unfolding. Until the very end, when something strange happened.
And that was the last I saw of Eldred Cooley,
she said triumphantly. Then her eyes, which had been blazing, seemed to go all cloudy.
The last time but one,
she murmured, placing her hand at her throat. Marilyn could hear a troubled note in her voice, and when she looked more closely, she noticed that Zenobia's fingers seemed to tremble as they clasped the golden chain she wore around her neck. Suddenly, she tightened her grip. For a moment, Marilyn thought she was going to pull off the amulet.
The last time but one,
she repeated. They waited respectfully, but it was almost as if Zenobia had left the porch. Her body was there, her white hair moving lightly in the breeze, her right hand clutching the last inch of her cigar. But she herself seemed to have vanished. Finally, Marilyn could stand the silence no longer.
Aunt Zenobia? Are you all right?
Zenobia blinked.
Of course, she said hurriedly. I was just thinking about Egypt. Egypt and Eldred Cooley and Suleiman.
You mean Solomon? Asked Kyle. Like in King Solomon's mines?
No, said Zenobia sharply.
Suleiman. Like in Suleiman. A lot of people get them confused. Remind me and I'll tell you about them sometime.
With that, she tossed her cigar butt over the porch railing and stalked into the house.